The year is 1933. A heavy black limousine pulls up to a modest farmhouse in Pennsylvania. Two men step out carrying a briefcase. Inside that briefcase is $18,000 in cash and a plan to destroy American democracy. We've been taught that fascism came to America through propaganda and foreign agents. That's a lie. The real threat came wrapped in three-piece suits, carried in leather briefcases, and financed by the biggest names on Wall Street. This wasn't ideology. This was a balance sheet problem, and when the ledger doesn't add up, the men who hold the debt will burn the world to collect. Let me take you back to what America looked like in that moment. The Great Depression wasn't just an economic downturn. It was a complete liquidation of the American dream. 1 in 4 men had no job, no income, no prospects. The factories stood silent like tombs. The fields turned to dust because there was no market for crops. In every major city, tent villages made of cardboard and scrap metal housed families who had lost everything. They called these places Hoovervilles, named with bitter sarcasm after the president who watched it all collapse. Children with swollen bellies from malnutrition played in the mud. Men in expensive suits sold apples on street corners for pennies. The suicide rate climbed every month. This was the landscape of total economic failure. But here's what the textbooks won't tell you. The Depression wasn't just hurting the poor. It was bleeding the rich. And that's when things got dangerous. The bankers and industrialists who actually ran the country were watching their bond portfolios collapse. They held millions in government and corporate bonds tied to the gold standard. Then in April 1933, the new president did something that made their blood run cold. Franklin Delano Roosevelt took America off the gold standard. Overnight, the bonds they held lost half their value. It wasn't a policy decision to them. It was a robbery. They felt like the government had reached into their vaults and stolen their money. Roosevelt was one of them by birth. He came from old money, attended the finest schools, moved in their social circles. But he had betrayed his class. He talked about social security, minimum wage laws, taxing the wealthy to feed the poor. To the banking elite, this looked like communism in a wheelchair. They watched the bread lines growing longer and saw revolution coming. They looked at Europe and saw a different path. In Italy, Mussolini had crushed the unions and made the trains run on time. In Germany, Hitler had just taken power in January and promised economic miracles. The corporate state, where business and government merged under strong leadership, seemed to work. It protected property. It protected profits. It maintained order. So in the marble halls of Wall Street, in the private clubs where only the wealthiest men could enter, a whisper started. A dangerous whisper. Maybe democracy had failed. Maybe Roosevelt needed to be removed. Maybe America needed a strong man who understood business. They had the money. They had access to weapons. They had connections throughout the military and the veteran community. What they needed was a general, someone the soldiers would follow, someone with enough prestige and authority to lead an army. They thought they found their man. His name was Smedley Darlington Butler. Butler was a living legend in 1933. He was the most decorated Marine in the history of the Corps. 2 medals of honor hung on his chest. He had fought in the Philippines, China, Central America, and France. He had commanded men in battles from jungle warfare to trench warfare. The troops who served under him called him Old Gimlet Eye and would have followed him into hell. He was everything the plotters thought they needed: a warrior, a leader, a man who understood discipline and order. But they made one catastrophic mistake. They never actually listened to what Smedley Butler believed. By 1933, Butler had undergone a profound transformation. He had spent 33 years in uniform serving his country. But when he retired and had time to reflect, he realized something that shattered him. Every war he had fought, every invasion he had led, had been for corporate profit. He had invaded Haiti to protect National City Bank's loans. He had invaded Nicaragua for the Brown Brothers brokerage house. He had invaded Honduras for the United Fruit Company's banana plantations. He called it a racket. War was a business, and he had been the muscle, the enforcer, Al Capone with better medals. This realization freed him to speak truth. He traveled the country giving speeches that terrified the establishment. The plotters saw the uniform and the medals and assumed he thought like them. That arrogance would destroy them. In July 1933, the black limousine arrived at Butler's farm. A bond salesman named Gerald McGuire and his associate climbed out. McGuire worked for Grayson MP Murphy and Company, a prestigious Wall Street brokerage. His boss, Colonel Grayson Murphy, sat on the boards of Goodyear, Bethlehem Steel, and Guarantee Trust, a bank controlled by J.P. Morgan. McGuire was smooth, confident, well-dressed. He talked about helping veterans, about the bonus payments that had been delayed until 1945. He said he represented wealthy patriots who wanted Butler to speak at an American Legion convention. Then McGuire opened his briefcase. $18,000 in cash. In 1933, when men worked for dollars a week, this was a fortune. McGuire said it was for expenses, for bringing supporters to Chicago, for rigging the convention. Butler's combat instincts screamed warnings. Veterans didn't have $18,000 lying around. This was something else. Something bigger. Something dangerous. He pushed the money back but didn't refuse outright. He wanted to know more. Who was behind this? What they really wanted. How deep the conspiracy went. So he played along. Over the following months, McGuire became a regular visitor. He took Butler to expensive restaurants, bought him drinks, flattered him, and slowly, carefully, he revealed the true plan. The gold standard was the key. The men McGuire worked for were furious about Roosevelt's currency devaluation. They wanted Butler to mobilize veterans as a political weapon, to terrorize Congress into restoring the gold standard. But it went deeper. McGuire talked about the country falling apart, about democracy failing, about the need for change. Then he told Butler something chilling. He had been sent to Europe on a research mission. His bosses paid for first-class travel to Italy, Germany, and France. Not to study art or culture, to study fascism. McGuire spoke with glowing admiration about a French group called the Croix de Feu, the Cross of Fire. Right-wing military veterans operating as a private army for business interests. They had marched on Parliament in a show of force. McGuire said America needed its own version. A super-organization of veterans. 500,000 men, armed and disciplined. Not loyal to the president or the Constitution, but to the leaders of business. An army to protect property and profits. And they needed someone to lead it. Someone the veterans would follow. A man on a white horse. They needed Smedley Butler. Butler sat there listening to treason being outlined like a business proposal. His face remained stone. Inside, rage built like a volcano. But he kept asking questions. Who's paying for this? How many men can you recruit? What's the exact plan? McGuire, thinking Butler was interested, got excited. He started naming names, real names of real people. He mentioned the Singer sewing machine fortune, the Rockefeller interests, the DuPont chemical empire. But the biggest name was J.P. Morgan, the most powerful bank in America. Then McGuire mentioned something that had just been formed, the American Liberty League. On paper, a political advocacy group defending the Constitution. In reality, McGuire said, the financial engine for the coup.
The American Liberty League was absolutely real. Formed in August 1934 by the wealthiest men in America. Leaders of General Motors, General Foods, DuPont. Men who owned the steel, the oil, the railroads. They hated Roosevelt with burning intensity. They called him a traitor, a socialist, a communist.
To them, the New Deal was the destruction of American freedom. McGuire laid out the operational plan with chilling precision. Recruit 500,000 veterans through the American Legion. Break away to form a new paramilitary force. Arm them with weapons from Remington Arms, controlled by DuPont. Everything in the family, McGuire said with a wink. Then march on Washington in overwhelming force. It wouldn't be violent at first. It would be a demonstration of power. surround the White House, fill the streets of the Capitol, demand an audience with Roosevelt. Butler asked what they would tell the president. McGuire smiled. They would be very polite, very respectful. Tell him the job was too much. His health was failing. He needed help. Propose a new cabinet position, Secretary of General Affairs. This secretary would hold all executive power, run the military, the Navy, the economy. Roosevelt would stay as president in name only, a figurehead, a puppet. The elected president would wave at parades. The secretary would run the country, exactly like Mussolini's model in Italy. Democracy would exist on paper, but it would be hollow. Then McGuire looked Butler in the eye and said the words, "You will be the secretary. You will be the dictator of the United States." Butler wanted to reach across the table and break the man's neck, but he understood tactical thinking. Killing McGuire wouldn't stop this. They would just find another general. Someone like Douglas MacArthur with his massive ego and authoritarian tendencies. Butler had to be smart. He had to gather evidence, let the conspiracy unfold enough to expose it completely. So he told McGuire he was interested. The lie tasted like poison, but he said he needed proof. He needed to meet the men at the top. McGuire arranged a meeting with Robert Sterling Clark, an heir to the Singer sewing machine fortune, millionaire many times over, art collector, world traveler, born into wealth so vast he never worked a day in his life. The meeting happened at the Bellevue Stratford Hotel in Philadelphia. Crystal chandeliers, marble floors, gilded fixtures, a temple of money. Clark didn't waste time. He told Butler straight out he was willing to spend half his fortune to save the other half. The gold standard was everything. If Roosevelt kept destroying the currency, civilization would collapse. Clark confirmed everything McGuire had said. The money was ready. The weapons could be obtained. They needed a strong man to lead. Then Clark pulled out his checkbook right there in the hotel lobby. He offered to write a check for tens of thousands of dollars to Butler's family, like he was buying a car, casual and matter of fact. Butler refused. But he had what he needed. A second witness. Confirmation this wasn't McGuire's fantasy, and Butler had been smart. He brought a reporter named Paul Comley French, introduced him as his personal secretary. Clark and McGuire spoke freely in front of him, never imagining every word was being recorded. French took meticulous notes, names, dollar amounts. The most damning quote from McGuire: "We need a fascist government in this country to save the nation from the communists who want to tear it down." There it was. The mask completely off. Butler was ready to strike. But who could he tell? The police were controlled by politicians in the pockets of these same men. The newspapers were owned by the industrialists. It was a closed system of corruption and mutual interest. If he just called a press conference, they would destroy him. Call him crazy, a paranoid soldier with shell shock. Destroy his credibility and bury the truth. He needed official documentation. Testimony under oath, a forum where he would be taken seriously. In November 1934, he contacted the House Un-American Activities Committee, the McCormack-Dickstein Committee investigating Nazi propaganda. Butler told them the real threat wasn't from Berlin. It was from Wall Street. The committee agreed to hear him, but they were terrified. Going after Morgan and DuPont could destroy their careers, so they made a fateful decision. Hold the hearings in secret. Executive session closed to the public. No press, no cameras. The truth could be spoken, but controlled. On November 20th, 1934, Smedley Butler walked into that committee room. He wore his best suit. He looked tired, but his gimlet eyes were sharp and focused. He placed his hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and then he spoke for 2 hours straight. He named Gerald McGuire. He named Robert Sterling Clark. He named the American Liberty League and its backers. He detailed the bribes, the $18,000 in cash, the checkbook Clark offered, the plan for 500,000 veterans, the plot to make Roosevelt a puppet. The congressman sat in stunned silence. It sounded like pulp fiction, too outrageous to be true. And yet the man telling it was the most decorated hero in America, a man whose integrity was beyond question. When Butler finished, he looked directly at the congressman. "You have the power to stop this. You have the power to save democracy. But you have to be brave enough to call these men to the stand." The committee thanked him and said they would investigate. Butler walked out, knowing the real battle was just beginning. The testimony leaked to the press the next morning. The headlines screamed, "General Butler alleges fascist plot. Plot to seize Washington exposed. Marine hero claims Wall Street conspiracy." The reaction was brutal and instantaneous. The New York Times called it a gigantic hoax. Their editorial board, men who socialized with Morgan partners and DuPont executives, mocked Butler's sanity. They said he was making up stories for attention, a washed-up general who couldn't handle retirement. Time magazine was crueler. They called it the plot of the cream puffs, ridiculing the idea that respectable bankers who played golf and donated to charity could commit treason. They made Butler a punchline. The accused men issued furious denials. Thomas Lamont of J.P. Morgan said it was too ridiculous to comment on. He laughed it off. Grayson Murphy threatened lawsuits. Robert Sterling Clark fled to Europe to wait out the scandal in comfort. Gerald McGuire was hauled before the committee but denied everything. Just a businessman having conversations. Never discussed a coup. That's insane. He sweated through his collar but stuck to his story. It looked like the cover-up would work perfectly. The media was destroying Butler's credibility with surgical precision. The public was confused. One soldier's word against the entire financial establishment. In that contest, the establishment always wins. But the committee didn't stop. They kept digging. Subpoenas went out. McGuire's travel records, his bank statements, dozens of witnesses were interviewed. And slowly the story cracked open. Letters emerged, written in McGuire's own hand, sent from Europe to his superiors. Not warnings about fascism, but praise. Admiration for Mussolini's efficiency. Detailed descriptions of paramilitary groups, written like field notes, not criticism. Proof he had been exactly where Butler said, doing exactly what Butler claimed. Then the money trail appeared. Tens of thousands of dollars flowing from wealthy industrialists into accounts McGuire controlled. Slush funds, no legitimate purpose. And then came Paul Comley French, a respected journalist, calm, precise. He testified under oath, confirming Butler's account word for word, including the chilling line about America needing fascism. He had written it down at the time. The committee reached a horrifying conclusion. Butler wasn't delusional. He wasn't lying. He was right. On February 15, 1935, Congress released its final report. It stated plainly that certain persons had attempted to establish a fascist organization in the United States. The plot was real. It had been planned. It could have been executed. But after total vindication, nothing happened. No arrests, no trials. Names were blacked out, files were sealed, and the story vanished. Because Roosevelt, facing depression and an approaching world war, chose stability over justice. Roosevelt understood the terrible truth. To defeat fascism abroad, America needed weapons, tanks, planes, ships, steel, explosives. And the factories to build them were owned by the very men who had tried to overthrow him. DuPont controlled the steel. DuPont controlled the chemicals. Wall Street controlled the war machine. Roosevelt faced an impossible choice, justice or survival. Punish traitors and cripple the nation's defenses, or bury the plot and prepare for war. He chose survival. No document was signed, no deal spoken aloud. But the message was clear. The business plot would disappear. The conspirators would walk free. In return, the Liberty League lost its bite, and the New Deal was no longer openly sabotaged. Realpolitik at its most cynical. Smedley Butler saved American democracy, but paid the price truth-tellers always pay. He was dismissed as a crank, a nuisance, a man who broke the code of silence. The most decorated Marine in history became an embarrassment to the establishment. He died in 1940, months before the war he warned was coming. No state funeral, no powerful men in attendance. just a quiet burial, and a nation that forgot the man who refused to be king and chose instead to remain a citizen.